Hello Jobinlings, Jobin.cloud excels at helping you avoid LinkedIn restrictions. So this video is mostly there to let you know what you can perfectly safely do with Jobin.cloud without having to worry about anything, even if it sounds too good to be true. And the one thing that you should keep an eye out for, which I'll be covering later on in the video, is an external factor that probably won't apply to most of you, but it's still worth mentioning. So most of these explanations will be done directly from the Jobin.cloud operations monitor. The operation monitor basically shows all your queued, currently running, completed, and paused operations. But the reason I'm running it here is because you have various menus for each of the operations you can run within Jobin.cloud. And from here, you'll actually be able to directly modify how many of these operations you want to run within a 24-hour basis, but it's also an easy reference point to, well, directly show the various operations you can run. So starting off with probably the operation that everyone probably has most of their questions centered around, are the LinkedIn invitations. And this is primarily because Jobin.cloud allows you to bypass the invitation limit, so it's, I guess, probably safe to assume that you think there's a certain limit or quantity that you shouldn't send out. But there isn't actually any limit whatsoever. The bypass feature allows you to send as many invitations as you want without ever actually getting your account in trouble. The only thing you should keep an eye out for is the actual acceptance rate on those invitations. If you've already used LinkedIn InMails in the past, you're probably familiar that LinkedIn isn't too happy if your InMails get declined too often. And you might also face that LinkedIn ends up temporarily blocking you from sending other InMails out. The same exact thing applies to invitations. So even if you can bypass the invitation limits and send out as many as you want, you are going to want to keep an eye out on that acceptance rate. The catch though is that, well, LinkedIn isn't designed to send, for example, 200 invitations in a single day. So LinkedIn is kind of checking the acceptance rate in a bit of a weird way. Now they never really publicly disclose this, so it's mostly just from what we've found out so far. But it seems that the acceptance rate on invitations is checked on certain set quantities. So the more invitations you send, the more likely LinkedIn will check the acceptance rate sooner. And if they check the acceptance rate sooner, this means the actual contacts that receive the invitation have less time to accept the invite, for LinkedIn will think that they ignored it, even if they end up accepting it later on. So this means that if I were to, for example, send 500 invitations in a single day, LinkedIn would probably check multiple times over within that same day the acceptance rate on the invitations, which would basically result in having a terrible acceptance rate because too few people would actually end up accepting the invite within such a short amount of time. So between 100 and 200 is, in my opinion, the sweet spot for invitations, because it's a decent enough amount that you can send at a daily basis to properly, I guess, have a strong outreach, but it's also low enough to give all the recipients a decent enough amount of time to actually accept those invites, so that when that checker on LinkedIn's end runs, there'll be sufficiently enough time for those contacts to actually accept it and avoid a little timeout on sending invitations for probably the remainder of the week. Passing over to messages. This limit is a bit less flexible in the sense that 200 is pretty much the max. If you send out more than 200 messages, your activity is simply too hyperactive to be considered human and would basically get you in trouble. So you'd usually only want to decrease this number if you don't want to send 200 messages a day, maybe because it's, I guess, harder to manage because lots more messages sent out and probably too many replies that you would maybe not have the time to respond to. So we really don't recommend setting a number higher than 200. Also keep in mind that messages you send out yourself would, well, basically include themselves into that pool of operations, but as long as you don't actually intensively send lots of messages, so like for example, as long as you don't send more than probably 20, then even if you send 200 with Jobin and send 20 on your own, that's not going to cause any issues. The main problem here is those messages should not send out too quickly, and that's exactly what this queue system is doing. It basically throttles those operations and sends them out at a more human-like pace, and then follows whichever actual daily throttles you give it. So shouldn't worry too much about messages as long as you don't manually message very intensively as well. So you'd probably never ever have any actual issues with this. Emails, these are completely separate outside of LinkedIn. So this is generally your actual email service provider. Your service provider does also have limits. So that depends on your provider, on the license you have with your provider. But Jobin is able in most cases to actually detect what the speeds are for your provider. So Jobin will automatically, for example, set that with this type of provider, you can say send 2000 a day and so on. But emails also have an option to send out at a human simulated speed because, of course, an inbox is able to see if an email is sent in bulk, which makes it very likely to be sent in spam. So this human-like simulated speed is basically sending out emails one by one and not actually in a batch simultaneously, therefore making those emails a lot less likely to end up in anyone's spam. Moving forward, back to the LinkedIn operations, we have profile imports. This is basically the standard import that you run whenever you extract from a LinkedIn search group, post, event, and so on, even when you run auto update on a profile. This operation is completely untraceable by LinkedIn, so there is no limit whatsoever. In fact, the throttle is also set on infinite. But you can, of course, always set a throttle on it if you don't maybe want to spend the entire queue's time on just running imports and instead want to leave some room for other operations. So this is just fully customizable and up to you. These imports completely untraceable, so you can leave them running as often as you want, no issues whatsoever on it. And now lastly, the profile plus contact info import. And this is the only actual operation you might get in trouble with. So this is where you want to probably pay the most attention. Basically, profile plus contact info import is a generic import similar to the one that is fully untraceable, but in addition to running the import of the profile, it also imports from the LinkedIn contact info menu. But whenever Jobin tries to extract from that contact info menu, the import no longer becomes untraceable, meaning LinkedIn is actually able to see and track that import as a profile view. Based on your LinkedIn subscription, you have a set amount of profile views you can have every day. And similar to all the other menus, whenever you click on them, you'll also find a text representation giving you some recommendations and so on. But you can also find, in this case, the actual rates based on the various LinkedIn subscriptions. So you can always set these depending on what LinkedIn subscription you have, but you do need to be careful because if you cancel your subscription with LinkedIn and you don't actually modify this throttle rate and you end up running an import that extracts from the contact info menu, then you might get in trouble. Though by default, Jobin will never try and run a import from that contact info menu, so it will only actually run that import if you manually check the option to do so. And also, the contact info menu is only something that you'd want to import from if there is, well, actual contact info, which you'd usually only have if you're importing first connections. So this isn't really a type of import you'd be running frequently. But the important thing to keep an eye out for is that these profile views is basically a shared pool, meaning that not only do the imports on Jobin utilize this profile view whenever this particular import is run, but also when you genuinely go on a LinkedIn page and open a profile, that will also count as a profile view. The issue is, of course, that Jobin can track what Jobin itself is doing, but not what you are doing. So if you're, for example, on LinkedIn Free, you've imported 150 profiles with their contact info menus, and then you also very intensively look at lots of profiles on LinkedIn, all within that same day. This is basically all going in that same shared pool of profile views, and this might get your account in trouble because you'll go over that allowed limit. So you can always customize and set this limit to, for example, 100. If I were, say, on LinkedIn Free, then this means I have a safe margin of 50 profile views I can trigger on my own as I browse LinkedIn. But on to the final and most dangerous thing that you should keep an eye out for that I mentioned earlier is simultaneous profile views. So as mentioned, this type of interaction can trigger a profile view, and these profile views might run simultaneously, meaning if Jobin runs an import and you look at a profile at the same time, this is very suspicious because, well, normal human behavior wouldn't simultaneously look at the same profile twice or at two different profiles simultaneously. But it's not necessarily going to get you in trouble instantly. This is more of an average. If this occurs too frequently, then LinkedIn can safely assume that there's something off with your profile and you might get a restriction. But since this requires a relatively high average of simultaneous views, you'd never actually get in trouble on this if you're exclusively running Jobin. This gets you in trouble if you have, for example, a VA or someone that you're sharing your LinkedIn account with, meaning that you not only have your own profile views, the profile views from your VA, and the potential profile views that might trigger from this contact import. Basically, the more you share your LinkedIn account, the more likely a simultaneous profile view will occur, and if these occur too frequently, that is going to get you in trouble. Another factor is that other extensions that interact with LinkedIn can trigger profile views, of course. So, for example, an email finder that pops up whenever you open a LinkedIn profile, that is basically pinging LinkedIn 1 second time on top of your own profile view. So if that occurs too frequently, that can get you in trouble. An easy way to tell if an extension is probably triggering a profile view whenever you open a LinkedIn profile yourself is when you actually get a pop-up. Those pop-ups can be detected by LinkedIn, and if you, for example, have a multitude of extensions, or maybe you have a VA with a multitude of extensions, then if all of these ping and pop up at the same time on that LinkedIn page, that's going to basically trigger multiple profile views on that profile simultaneously, and if that occurs too frequently, that will get you in trouble. But of course, preventing is better than curing, so if you want to prevent ever triggering a profile view in general, then Jobin has you covered, because whenever you import in bulk from searches, groups, and posts and so on, you extract them with the standard import, which is untraceable, and you can then view them directly in your Jobin repository, which is separate from LinkedIn and will therefore not trigger any profile views. I hope you found this useful and that you learned something new on how to best avoid LinkedIn restrictions.